JavaScript is one of the most popular programming languages. According to GitHub, JavaScript is the top programming language, and it's more than twice as popular as the runner-up, Python. Learning the JavaScript language is valuable for any developer. JavaScript is the language of the web, supported by all major browsers. But tools exist to take JavaScript far beyond web pages. You can create native smartphone and tablet apps, desktop apps for Windows and Mac, and even server-side apps using JavaScript. In this course, I'll cover JavaScript programming for those who are completely new to programming. This is also valuable for programmers who are just new to the JavaScript language. We'll learn the JavaScript features needed to get you started, and we'll build the card game Blackjack along the way as a sample project. By the end of this course, you'll know the very basics of JavaScript, and you'll be able to build simple programs for the web. No prior knowledge of programming is required for this course. I hope you'll join me on this journey in learning how to program with JavaScript is used on the vast majority of websites and is supported by every major browser. The language has evolved to support the creation of business applications on the web. And with web connectivity built in, almost any kind of utility, security, or data application can be created using JavaScript. Games can be created with JavaScript as well. You may have heard of Unity, a popular game engine for 3D and 2D games. JavaScript is supported as a programming language for this engine. For large business applications, JavaScript is popular and has been embraced by a scalable language called TypeScript. This language is a superset of JavaScript, so you'll need to understand JavaScript well in order to write large-scale business applications and other software using TypeScript. JavaScript is not just for applications which run in browsers on the web. You can also create native applications for smartphones and tablets using JavaScript. A popular technology for this is Apache Cordova. JavaScript can also be used to create full-fledged applications for the Mac and Windows desktops. There's no need for a browser at all. A popular technology to accomplish this is Electron. Writing server-side code can also be accomplished in JavaScript. You can create web servers, web APIs, and other services using a technology called Node.js. So JavaScript is a multi-platform language. It will run in any modern web browser. It can be used to create native applications on smartphones and tablets. It can create desktop software for Mac and Windows computers, and it can be run on any backend server as well. No matter where you want your application to run, you can code it in JavaScript. In this course, I'll teach you the very basics of how to develop software using JavaScript. In the next clip, I'll show you how we can get up and running very quickly. In order to start working with JavaScript, there's certain software that needs to be installed on our machines. I'm on a Windows device, so we're at a command prompt. But on a Mac, you would go to a terminal window. And the first thing I want to do is I want to see if Git is installed. So I can type git -- version. And I do have it installed, but if you get some kind of error here, you can install Git at this site, git-scm.com. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see the downloads button, and it's available for Mac, Windows, and Linux. And once Git is installed, the next thing we need is Node.js. Specifically, we need the npm package manager, which comes bundled with it. We can type npm -- version. And you can see that npm is installed here. But again, if it's not installed, you can visit nodejs.org and download it here. This is detecting that I have Windows, but if you click the other downloads link, there are versions for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And the last thing we need is a code editor. In this course, I'll be using Visual Studio Code. You can download that at code.visualstudio.com. And this editor and the other tools are all free. You can just download the version for your operating system, whether it's Mac, Windows, or Linux. Going back to the command prompt, you'll know code is installed because you can just type code. And that starts up the editor with the welcome screen. And those are the three main tools that you're going to need for this course. Again, you'll need Git, npm, and Visual Studio Code. In the next clip, we'll build a Hello World application, which will be our starting point. Now that we have all the tools installed, let's create our first project. Traditionally, the first thing you do when you learn a new programming language is to have it print out the words "Hello World." And we'll do that with the help of GitHub. Pluralsight has a good starting point for your JavaScript applications. So let's go there. I'm at github.com/pluralsight/web-dev-starter. And this is a great starting point for JavaScript application development. You can see the project name here. And what I'll do is I'll click this clone or download button. And we want to clone it. So I'll hit this copy button. And that simply copies the URL that we need. So back at the command prompt, the command we need to execute is git clone. And then I'll type Control-V to paste in that URL that we just copied. You can see that it ends in web-dev-starter.git. I'll hit enter. And we clone the project. It put it in a folder called web-dev-starter. So let's cd to that directory. And if I do a dir to get a directory of all the files, you can see the files from the project. To start off Visual Studio Code right from the command prompt here, I can type code and dot for the current directory. So Visual Studio Code starts with our welcome page. I'll shut that down. And you can see the files for the project on the left here. This is called the Explorer pane or Explorer panel. And you can see the main file index.html right here. I'll click on that and you can see the hello world text right here. Now before we run this project, there's something very important we need to do in the command prompt. I'm in the web dev starter folder and I need to install the npm packages that belong to this project. So I'll type npm install. And after a few seconds, everything will be installed. And one thing to be aware of if you're on a Mac, you may need to run sudo before the command. So the command would be sudo npm install. That'll run the install as the super user, and that'll guarantee that you have the right permissions to install everything properly. But depending upon how your Mac is set up, you may not need sudo. If you do use it, you'll need to enter your password. So going back to Visual Studio Code, what that npm install command did was it looked at package.json and it looked at this dev dependencies item and it saw that we needed to install the light server version 2.5.4 and it actually installed that. If we look in the node modules folder, you'll find it in here if you scroll down, but all these other packages here are dependencies. But there's no need to go looking through this. As long as you see the node modules folder here and it's populated, the install should be okay. Now to actually look at this index.html page in a browser, we need to run that light server that we saw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type control backtick, and that brings up the Windows PowerShell. It'll bring up a terminal in a Mac. And I'll just bump up the font a bit here so we can see it better. And now we have a terminal right here in our editor. Now you'll notice that I executed the npm install in that separate command prompt window right here. And for some reason, that's a safer way to do it. If you execute an npm install within this terminal, you may or may not run into certain errors. So for safety, always run npm install from a command prompt or terminal outside of Visual Studio Code. But once we're here, we can type npm run start. And that starts up Light Server, and it opens up the browser for us. We get hello world. And you can see that Light Server is running on localhost port 3000. Throughout this course, what I'll mostly be doing is having the browser open next to the editor. So I'll make the browser as small as it can go, which is right here. And then I'll take the editor and just make that fit. And I'll reduce the font a little bit. And I can close the Explorer by clicking on this button right here. We can always get it back again. It's like a toggle switch. And our server is running, so I'll just X out of this terminal. So there we have it. Our Hello World application is working. Now, one of the benefits of Light Server is that all we need to do is make a change to the source code. So I'll delete world. And as soon as I save this file, the browser will automatically refresh. And we get hello in the browser. So this is a great way to develop. When you start your session, you just kick off the server, and from there on out, you just save your files to have them update in the browser. So Hello World is working, but we want to be working with a website that's a little bit more sophisticated. And in the next clip, we'll set that up. Throughout this course, we'll be using a sample website that's part of the downloadable files for this course. And it's all based upon that GitHub project that we just saw. Here's the Pluralsight page for this course, JavaScript Getting Started. And this is most likely where you're viewing this course from. To get the exercise files, the link is right here. I'll click on it. And we can see the big blue button, Download Exercise Files. This downloads a zip file, and I'll open it right here. Looking at these folders, these correspond to the module numbers in the course. So if we're on Module 5, we can go into Demos. Now this After folder contains the project after the module is completed. And Before is the snapshot before the module starts. So you can pick whichever one you'd like. I'll go into After, and the demo project is in this js-demo folder. So what you want to do is extract these files into your working folder on your local device. So I'll extract these and we'll look at these in the command prompt. So I extracted this project into this JS demo folder. I'll execute dir so we can see what's in the directory. And most importantly, we're going to need this package.json file to show that we're in the right place. And we are. And just like we did with the Hello World application from GitHub, we need to execute npm install. That was successful, and if I do dir again, you'll notice now we have a node modules folder. So npm install looked at package.json and downloaded all our packages for us into node modules. Let's go to Visual Studio Code and we'll pick up this project from there. I can just type code dot for the current folder. So here's the project, and if we look at index.html, you can see now that there's much more to it. The title of the site is Carved Rock Fitness. It's somewhat of a sporting goods store. And the only two differences between this and the Hello World project are this index.html page. And in the CSS folder, there's a main.css file, which has all the styles for the site. So I'll hit Control backtick. That'll pull up the terminal, and let's run this project. I'll execute npm run start. And Light Server starts up, and you can see the website here. And it is fully responsive. If we open it up wide, we can see the header and some kind of banner and the contents of the site. But throughout this course, we want to see the code editor as we work with it. So I'll keep it small, and because it is responsive, it does rearrange pretty well. We can look through the site and see all the parts lined up properly. Throughout most of this course, we'll be working with this string right here. It's not until the end of the course that we'll start modifying the web page in more detail. But to start with, we need some kind of output. So we'll use this string, get a grip, as output. And you'll see how we do that. But there's another way we can show output. If I right-click and select Inspect, we can see the console. I'll click on the console link. And in some cases, we will be showing output here in the console. Now your console may be docked to different sides of this browser window. You can click on this icon, and you can dock it to the right side, to the bottom, and so on, right here. I like to keep it docked to the bottom. And when the console is showing, you still have full access to the website. Now we're all set up with this project, but it does not use JavaScript yet. And that's one of the first things we'll learn in the next module of this course. So I'll see you there where we'll start writing our first JavaScript code. We'll start off this module by seeing how we can add JavaScript code to an HTML page. It's important to know the location where we add the code and the syntax of how to add the code. We'll see how we can work with multiple JavaScript files in a single HTML document. It's very common for a web page to have multiple JavaScript files, not just one. Next, we'll take a look at formatting our code, specifically how JavaScript works with whitespace. Whitespace refers to spaces and tabs and new line characters, and those are used mainly to make our code look good and easy to read. Next, we'll take a look at how we can detect and fix errors in our source code. As a new JavaScript coder, there's a lot to learn. So when errors happen, we need to be able to spot them quickly and fix them right away. Next, we'll take a look at case sensitivity in JavaScript. It is important that lowercase letters are different than uppercase letters, and we'll see how that works in JavaScript. Finally, we'll take a look at how we can comment our code. Sometimes code is tricky or complex, and we need to leave notes for whatever developers look at that code in the future. Comments are written in your plain native language, so you don't have to worry about any JavaScript errors within your comments. Let's get started and look at how we can use the script tag in HTML to include our JavaScript code. Our starting point for coding in JavaScript is actually an HTML page. One of the primary uses for JavaScript is to change the markup or change the document that's being shown in a browser. The usual starting page is called index.html. We won't be going into HTML in too much detail. Understanding it is a bit of a prerequisite for this course, but we need to see how we can link up JavaScript code into our index.html page, or any HTML page. Here we can see a script tag. We have the starting tag and the ending tag. And between these, we can put any JavaScript code that we'd like. And this code will execute directly in the web page. Let's take a look at how this works. Here we have the index.html file that we set up in the last module. If we look at our list of files, index.html is right here. And I'll just close the Explorer so we have more space to view the code. What I'll do is I'll scroll down to the bottom, and we'll place our script tag directly above the closing body tag. So here's our closing body tag, and above it, we'll add script, and we'll place the closing script tag below it. And now we can actually start writing JavaScript code. So I'll enter a simple alert command, and I'll just say hello world. And there's our first line of code. Now before I save this and execute it, we need to make sure that our live server is up and running. So I'll type Control backtick to bring up our command prompt. And I'll enter the command npm start. So our web server is running. It's on localhost :3000. And I'll just close out our console. And I'll close out the old browser window. So now as we save changes in our HTML file or in the JavaScript that we write, the results will appear immediately in our web browser. So I'll save our code, and the message comes up. Localhost 3000 says hello world. So this is working fine. I'll hit OK. So we just wrote our first line of JavaScript code. Now just to understand this, alert is a function, and we'll be learning about functions later in the course. And hello world in single quotes here, that's called a string. We'll also be learning about strings. But for now, just know that by executing this command, alert hello world, we're going to get one of those pop-ups with the message in it. So I'll just save this again. And there's our pop-up saying hello world. And let's add another line of code. After hello world, let's print out the name of this company we're working with, Carved Rock Fitness. I'll type alert, and in single quotes, I'll say Carved Rock Fitness. I'll save it. And we got our first message, hello world. I'll click OK. And our second message, Carved Rock Fitness. So just to recap, we can place our JavaScript code between script tags in our HTML file. But this really isn't the best place to put JavaScript code. It's better to have JavaScript code in its own file. That way we have a nice separation. Our markup, HTML5 code, will be in the HTML file, and our JavaScript code can be in a .js file. And even though it might be easier at times just to use one single file for both the HTML markup and the JavaScript code, as you can see here, it's a best practice to separate them. So in the next clip, we'll see how we can take our JavaScript code and put it in its own file. We saw how to use the script tag in our HTML file, but it's very uncommon to use that for our JavaScript code. It's much more common to use a JavaScript file. And there are two reasons for this. First off, we want to separate our markup, our HTML code, from our JavaScript code. This will keep things clear in our head, and if multiple people are working on the project, it makes things simpler. And another important reason to use a JavaScript file is that we can use that file in multiple web pages. Usually a website is many pages, and they can all share the same JavaScript files if needed. Let's see how we set this up. So we'll be working in our index.html file again, and here's how we can load a script from an external file. We use the script tag, and we use the src for source attribute. And in this example, our file is called filename.js. And for most web servers, it's very important to have this / at the beginning. That just tells us the directory where the JavaScript file is located. Here, the dot represents the directory that the index.html file is located in. So we have a relative path and a file name. And notice that we need the end tag as well, /script right here. If you're familiar with XML, you might be used to using a shortcut such as this, where we end the script tag with a /. But this is wrong. Even though it's valid XML, it is not valid HTML. And even though this syntax will work in most modern browsers, it won't work in some older browsers. So to be safe, just make sure to use a full script tag, as we see here again, end it with /script. Let's go to Visual Studio Code and create a JavaScript file and read it into index.html. I'm in index.html, and here's the script section from our last clip. I'll modify this by eliminating our JavaScript code, and we'll add a source attribute, and I'll call it home.js. And we'll be sure to create home.js in the same folder as index.html. I'll select New File, home.js, and let's just put some code in here to make sure it's working. I'll alert hello world. Now I want to make sure to save both these files, so I'll save JavaScript and I'll save index.html. And I'll make sure to refresh here, and we get our message hello world. So now we can isolate all our JavaScript code to home.js. We simply need to modify this file to make changes to JavaScript, and we can leave index.html alone. I'll add another alert. I'll just say second message, and I'll save this, and we get the message hello world and second message. Now I just want to take a look back at the index.html page because there's something there worth seeing. If we scroll up to the top, and I'll just expand out this page, we can see several script tags here where we're setting the source attribute to JavaScript files. And just to look at the first one, you can see that we're using jQuery. So things like jQuery and Bootstrap and libraries that span the entire project that don't rely on the web page can be placed up here in the head section. But we're not going to be doing that in this course because the JavaScript that we write needs to be able to modify the web page. So it actually wouldn't work if we placed our script tag here. We want to make sure to place our script tag at the very end after all the HTML is loaded. And that's what we're doing, so that's fine. Now, one thing I want to do is I want to add a second JavaScript file. Normally, when you create a web page, it'll have many JavaScript files. So let's go ahead and create a utility script file. I'll just call it utils.js. I'll save this and I'll go ahead and create that file. Utils.js. And utils is just a common abbreviation for utilities. That would be code that you use throughout your web page or your entire website. But I want to create a function here. We're not going to cover functions now, but we just need a way to be able to slightly modify our web page. And we'll be covering that later in the course. So for now, I'll just enter some code and we'll discuss it later. So the only important thing to know for now is that we created something called show message. And we want to use that to show a message on the website. In order to do that, first let's take a look at the web page. And we can see this message here, get a grip. Let's use that temporarily just to show some output from our JavaScript code. We can find that in our HTML markup by just searching for get a grip. I'll hit Control F to find, and I'll search for get a grip right here. And in order to work with this, we simply need to give it an ID called message. So now that function that I just created, we'll be able to modify these characters right here, get a grip. And again, we'll be covering functions and how to manipulate a web page later in this course. But for now, let's just go to home.js. And instead of these alerts, we'll call show message. And we'll just type the characters changes to show how we can change a web page. So I'll save this. And we have to save utils. You can tell by the circle right here, it needs to be saved. I can go to File, Save All. And I'll refresh the page. And we can see that it says changes. And just to show that it is working, I'll change it to something else. I'll change it to title and save it. And as soon as I save it, browser sync kicks in and we see the title showing up right here. So this will make things a lot easier to work with than having to click OK on all those pop-ups that are showing up. Whenever we want to show something as we're learning JavaScript, we just need to write show message and pass whatever information we want to show. So we're all set up to learn JavaScript. But before we start diving too far into the language, there are a few basic things we need to know about spacing and formatting and case sensitivity, and we'll cover those next. Let's take a look at how JavaScript allows us to format our code. I'll show you what I mean by this. So looking at our home.js file, we have a single line of code. But what does JavaScript do about whitespace? Whitespace are things like spaces or tabs or even new lines. I'll hit enter a few times and I'll change the text here to changed and I'll save it and we'll see what JavaScript does. So our code still worked fine, even though we have all this white space before our actual code. We can also add white space between symbols usually. We have show message, and I'll add some spaces and tabs in there. I'll save it. And our code still works fine. Even if we broke this apart and put changed on its own line and push down the closing parenthesis a bit, I'll save this. And again, that also works fine. Now, just because you can do this doesn't mean you should. There are some cases where white space can help the developer understand the code better. But in code like this, I'll just hit Control-Z to back up. We generally don't want to start a line with white space, and we generally don't want to put white space between symbols unless we need to or unless it really helps clarify the code. Now, before parentheses, some developers like to put a space in there. And that's fine, as long as you stay consistent with how you code, or you follow the guidelines of the group you're in. But for me, I like leaving that space out and having it run together like this. Later in the course, we'll see how indentation and indenting lines of code can really help clarify what the code is doing. And if we had more than one line of code, which is going to be the case usually, I'll just copy this one, and I'll just say title 2. You want your code to line up on the left side. And adding space is possible, but only add empty lines if it helps clarify the code. You want to make sure that if you have to revisit this code yourself, or if another developer needs to look at it, that they can clearly understand what's going on. And sometimes blank lines help with that. So I'll save this, and we get our title 2 showing up right here. In the next clip, we'll take a look at errors and how we can tell if there's an error in our code. It's very common when you're learning to program to run across errors. As a coder, you need to be perfect. If JavaScript doesn't know what you're attempting to accomplish, it will throw an error. And let's see how we can detect these errors and fix them. Here's our code from the last clip, and let's create an error. We have show message title 2 right here, and I'm just going to chop this word in half. You can't do that in JavaScript, so there will be an error. I'll save this. And looking at the page, we can see that our title shows right here. But it doesn't say title 2, it just shows title. So this first line of code ran perfectly, but the second line of code, which we cut in half, didn't run at all. And there's an error that we can't see. The way to detect this is to use the browser tools, and I'm using Chrome, but pretty much any browser has similar tools. I'll right-click and go to Inspect. It pulls up developer tools. And this might look a little bit complex, but let's simplify it. First of all, we'll click on Console, and this is the console where JavaScript will show all our errors. And we can see here that the error is uncaught reference error. Show MES is not defined. So anything red with this red X right here is an error. And if we look closely at this home.js:3, that means it's in the home.js file, which is the file we're working with, and line 3. So that helps us pinpoint exactly where the problem is. To fix it, I'll just go back and patch it back together. I'll type Control-S to save it, and we see it's working now. Title 2 is showing, and our console is empty. So I'll create another error just so we can see it. I'll enter some random symbols, and that'll cause an error. I'll save it, and we can see the error right here. Uncaught syntax error. Unexpected token, and it's the caret. So it just doesn't know what the caret symbol is. And to clean it up, I'll just remove that, hit save, Control-S, and everything's good again. Now, sometimes it's useful to use the console for debugging purposes on your own. Let me go ahead and remove this second show message. We don't need that. And I can type console.log. And again, this is an object with a function call, which we'll be covering later in the course. But for now, just know that you can use console.log in the parentheses to write out any message you want. I'll hit save, and you can see that any message shows up in our console. It's not an error, it's not red, but this could be very useful as you're programming. You may need to look at certain information, and it might be hard to show it on the web page itself, but you can use the console. For the most part in this course, we're going to be modifying the web page, so we won't be writing out to the console unless we need to. So it's a good idea throughout this course, and as you're experimenting and playing around with code, to keep the console open. If something doesn't work the way you expect it to, take a look for an error in the console. In the next clip, we'll take a look at case sensitivity. Case sensitivity in JavaScript refers to whether or not the case of names are important or not. For example, is a lowercase a the same as an uppercase a? In some languages it is, but in JavaScript it's not. And this is the source of a lot of bugs. Let's see how JavaScript deals with this. Here's our code from the last clip, and we know that show message will change the title right here. But what if we typed show message with a capital S? I'll save this. And our browser paused it, so I'll hit the continue button, and I'll go to the console, and we can see that we do have an error message. Uncaught reference error, show message with a capital S is not defined, and it tells us that it's in home.js line 1. And we can also see that it's right, the code didn't work. It still says get a grip. It doesn't say title. So again, changing that back to a lowercase s, I'll save it, and everything works fine. And you may have noticed this capital M for a message in the middle of show message. And that's very common in JavaScript. If you're using a symbol that's made up of multiple words, generally the first word is lowercase, show, and all the other words are capitalized, as in message. If we make that a lowercase m and save it, we once again get the error. I'll resume it and show the console, and show message, all lowercase, is not defined. It's an error. So I'll undo this and save it just to make sure we're good. And it's always important to understand that JavaScript is case sensitive. You can't mix up lowercase and uppercase letters at all. Everything has to be precise. In the next clip, we'll take a look at adding comments to our code. When we're coding, some of our source code may become tricky or complex, or maybe there's just something about it that other developers won't understand. So we need to be able to comment our code. We need to be able to write normal phrases in English or whatever our speaking language is, so that developers in the future will be able to understand what's going on. And you also want to leave comments for yourself. Very often you'll write some code and you won't visit it again for weeks, months, or years. So you want to remember what your code is doing. Let's see how we can comment our code. Here we see a single line comment. It begins with 2 forward slashes. And because of the white space rules that we saw earlier, this can appear anywhere. It can be at the end of another line of code. It can be on its own line. It can be indented. Just know that as soon as JavaScript sees a // everything for the rest of that line is a comment. And you can write anything you'd like there. It won't be an error. If you want more than a one-line comment, there are special symbols to create multi-line comments. At the beginning, you enter /*, and at the end, the symbol is */. But anything between these two symbols is treated as a comment. It won't generate an error, and you can write anything you'd like. Let's see this in action. Here's our code from the last clip, and normally you wouldn't give a comment to this line because it's pretty obvious what it does. But if you did have a more complex line and you wanted to add a comment, you enter 2 forward slashes and whatever you'd like to write. And I'll save this and we can see that we get no errors in our console. For multi-line comments, we can enter /* and */. They don't have to be on separate lines. They can be on the same line. Just whatever is between these two symbols is a comment. It won't generate an error. So you can detail complex logic or some algorithm or write up whatever you'd like. A very common use for multi-line comments is your source code license. You'll see license information usually within comments at the top of a source code file. And most organizations do have a policy on adding copyright information. That all goes into comments. So I'll save this just to make sure it still works, and our console is clear. There are no errors. Let's wrap this module up with the summary. We started off this module by seeing how we can include our JavaScript within HTML files. We saw how we could use the script and script tag, and we could place any JavaScript code between these tags, but that's not very common. It's more common to use a script tag with the source attribute set to a JavaScript file name. That way we can reuse that file in multiple web pages, and it also keeps a good separation of concerns. Our HTML content stays in an HTML file, and our JavaScript code stays in its own file. We saw how we could format code using whitespace, and we could freely use whitespace. We could add it to the beginning or end of lines or between symbols, but as a best practice, we want to line things up on the left side margin. And we'll see more of that throughout this course as we start writing more code. We saw how to detect errors in the browser's console. You usually can press F12 to pull up the developer tools, or right-click and select Inspect. And you want to look at the console. That's where any error messages will show up in the browser. And we took a look at case sensitivity. JavaScript is case sensitive. You always need to be careful that you're using lowercase or uppercase characters properly. And finally, we looked at commenting our code. Any kind of complexity or anything tricky or anything that could be confusing should be commented in your code. We can add single line comments by using a forward slash twice, slash slash, or we can have multiple line comments by specifying forward slash star and any characters, including new line characters, up until a closing star slash. This comment is on one line, but usually the slash star and the star slash are on separate lines with a lot of information in between. It could be a software license, a copyright notice, an explanation of a complex algorithm, or anything. So those are the very basics of writing JavaScript code. In the next module, we'll take a look at variables. Variables are symbols that you use all the time in JavaScript, and we'll go into them in detail.